It's not possible. There's no way to understand the history of Jai-Alai in the US without considering the Berenson family. The patriarch, Richard Berenson, took over Miami Jai-Alai in 1929. 6 years later, he succeeded in having Jai-Alai wagering legalized. Miami Jai-Alai, under Berenson's management, became the mecca of the frontons. The best rosters were the best players wanted to play. Decades of glory in Florida and Connecticut, including 2 strikes that shook the industry. To talk about it, I'm with the third member of the dynasty, Richard Berenson. How are you?
Great, Juan. How are you today?
Okay. I was wishing to talk to you. See, I was eager to talk to you, Richard.
And I'm very eager to talk to you and discuss all the things that interest us about Jai-Alai, which for me, almost my whole life, I've been involved in Jai-Alai, although the last several years I haven't. We've been out of the business, but most of my life, certainly my young life, I was always involved in Jai-Alai, and I'd love to talk about it.
All right. So let's see, Richard. Your grandfather, Richard, began, like, as I said, in 1929, right? He died in 1967. You were 13 years old. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, at that point, I was only 12 years old when he died. And to speak about him, everyone called him Dick Berenson. That was his name. Short for Richard is one of the nicknames is Dick. So everyone called him Dick Berenson. So my grandfather, the reason he got into Jai-Alai to begin with was he was working for the First National Bank of Boston at the time. He was working as a guy that would go in to businesses that were failing or not doing well that the bank had loans on, and he would turn them around, make them profitable, or get them sold so the bank would get their money. That was his job for the First National Bank of Boston. He moved to Miami in 1927 or 28 because my father was 3 years old at the time. He had very bad asthma, had trouble breathing. They didn't have the medicines today that they had back, today we have medicines to take care of that. They didn't have that back then. So he almost died a couple times as an infant. So the doctor said either move to Arizona or move to Florida because the climate is better. So he decided to move to Florida, and he had decided to move to Miami, and the First National Bank had him do various jobs down here with loans that they had. And then finally one day they said to him, well, there's a Jai-Alai called Biscayne fronton that was recently rebuilt. It originally was on a parking lot on Hialeah Racetrack. It was blown down in 1929 by the hurricane. So in the early 30s, the Jai-Alai was rebuilt and called Biscayne Jai-Alai, where it's still located today. So sometime in the early 30s, I don't know the exact year, but my First National Bank of Boston said, look, the Jai-Alai is not doing well. We want you to go in there and see what you can do to turn it around and tell us what needs to be done. So when my grandfather got there in the early 1930s, after it was already built, he ran a season or two, and he said, you know what? The only way we're going to make money here is with gambling. Otherwise, it's not going to make it. We can't make it on any other way. So here's what happened. Very interesting. At that time, only horse racing was legal in Florida. There was no other gambling that was legal in Florida, only horse racing. So they had a very strong, what you call lobby, meaning their lawyers was very tight with the state to try to keep them exclusively the only gambling in Florida. So at the time, ironically, there were people that wanted to put dog tracks in Florida, all over Florida. And my grandfather aligned himself with them, and they worked together, the dog track people and my grandfather, to try to do what they could to get jai-alai legalized. And the way they went about it was very, very smart. The state saying, look, this is a monopoly. You're not allowed to have monopolies, and because only horse racing is legal. That's not fair. Then they explained to the state how being able to legalize jai-alai and dog racing would produce a lot of new jobs in the state. It would produce a tremendous amount of revenue for the state, because remember, part of everything is bet. Part of it goes to the jai-alai or dog track. Part of it goes to the state, and then the rest goes to the people who win the bets. So there was a lot of money that the state could get from jai-alai and dog racing in the state, and the jobs. It would create a lot of economic interest. Plus, dog racing was already popular in other states, so a lot of people would come down on vacation and from other states that have it, and they would want to go to the dog racing. So my grandfather said, once they see jai-alai, they're going to love it, and they're going to be coming down in droves to see it, which turned out to be true, by the way. So they worked together, the dog people and my grandfather, to get it legalized. They brought up all the points I just mentioned, and they wined and dined the legislatures, and explained to them how this is a great win-win situation for the state and for the people of Florida that needed jobs at the time. So in 1935, jai-alai and dog racing were both legalized, and it was a huge victory for my grandfather and for the dog racing people. Keep in mind, at that time, there was only one jai-alai in Florida, which was Biscayne, fronton, which my grandfather later changed the name to Miami Jai-Alai. So that's how jai-alai was legalized in the state of Florida. He did it.
But the first years were tough because the Great Depression, economical crisis, Miami was down. It wouldn't be too easy.
Well, that probably ironically helped get jai-alai and dog racing legalized, because the state was in trouble financially also. They needed money. So ironically, that might have helped him get jai-alai legalized, ironically.
Your grandfather and Pedro Mir, the player's manager, were very close, good partners. Yes. Is that so? Is that right?
Yes, Pedro Mir was the first player manager we'll call it Miami Jai-Alai from now on. He was the first player manager there. My grandfather relied on him because my grandfather didn't know anything about the game when he bought it. When he got in from the bank. Also, one side note, the partners in Miami Jai-Alai at that time, they told my grandfather, if you get jai-alai legalized, we'll give you 10% of the company. So that's how he got a original stake in Miami Jai-Alai, was they gave it to him once he got it legalized. But Pedro Mir, my grandfather relied on to sign great jai-alai players and talent, because my grandfather didn't know the game because he was just introduced to it.
So if I understand well, your grandfather took 10% of the business and later on the whole business?
No, we never owned more than 19% of the business. There were all kind of partners. Ironically, they were all from where my father and grandfather were from, Boston. And he actually knew some of them from living in Boston. And then there was one other family in Florida, the Worley family, who were the lawyers for the fronton in Florida, and they also owned a piece.
Yeah, your grandfather, as I said, died in 1977. You were about 12 years old. How was
he died? Actually, he died in 1967.
1967, so pretty young, eh?
I was young. I was only 11 to 12 years old.
Yeah, he was pretty young too, see? No?
Yes, he died at the age of 70, almost 74.
74. How was he? He was a storyteller, was very kind with you. How was your grandfather? What memories do you have?
He was a tremendous character. He was a very big man. He probably weighed 280 pounds. He was 6'2", very big guy, had a loud voice. My father used to say he would yell for him and you'd hear him all across the fronton. He was a real character, a very bright man. And he he was very funny. He loved the players. He got along with them. They all loved him. He knew more people than I can imagine. Example, we would go into restaurants in Miami, and I would hear people go, "Oh, there's Dick Berenson. There's Dick Ber-" You know, he knew everybody. And he was just an amazing person. And I would like to say this: one of the first things he did once Jai-Alai was legalized was he invented the quinella form of wagering, where you pick two numbers, and then either one can come in first or second, but they had to be those two numbers. He introduced that because prior to that, the only gambling at pari-mutuels was win, place, and show. So he introduced the quinella, and once he did that, everybody copied him. Then later on, he introduced the exacta, which they now call the perfecta, where you have to pick the two numbers correctly, and that also everyone copied. He was very innovative, and he was very successful in everything he ever did.
So your grandfather and a person named Jacobs tried to open up a fronton in New York, in Manhattan, in 1938. Is that so?
Yes. What happened was after my grandfather got Miami Jai-Alai going, and we were starting to do very well with the gambling, he was very friendly with two men that he knew from his days living in Boston and New York. One of them was Lee Schubert, who was a very famous guy that owned a lot of theaters. In fact, there's a very famous theater in New York called the Schubert Theater, named after him, Lee Schubert. My grandfather was very good friends with him. And also Lou Jacobs was a fight promoter who my grandfather knew very well. In fact, my father used to say he would get a big kick out of it, because when he used to visit Lou Jacobs was representing Joe Louis at the time. So my father, as a little boy, got to watch Joe Louis train and get to know him and all that, which he was excited about. But they decided that they wanted to try to put Jai-Alai in New York. They rented the Hippodrome, which at the time was empty. They built a court in the Hippodrome for Jai-Alai. And unfortunately, unlike my grandfather's success in Florida, he tried hard to get Jai-Alai legalized in New York, but the horse lobby was too strong. In fact, it's so strong that, as you know, no other pari-mutuel wagering ever, dogs or Jai-Alai, ever got into New York. It was just horse tracks. So he failed there. It only lasted 1 year.
Your father, Stanley Berenson, succeeded your grandfather, Richard. No? Your father was involved in Jai-Alai since he was a child?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
My father had a much better,
Did he know all the ins and outs of the business?
Yes. My father, not only did he know all the ins and outs of the business, but he also learned the ins and outs of the game from the players and watching them. And he even played a little amateur Jai-Alai himself.
Did he ever practice, your father?
Yes, he did.
He did?
He did. The only problem is he was left-handed.
Yeah.
So he could throw with the left side. He scared him, but he had no right side because he was left-handed. So, but he learned the game that way, and he also learned, how the qualities of good players versus not so good players. And he learned it from Pedro Mir as well.
Yeah. Yes. Keep on, Richard. Yeah.
Yeah. So my father was very innovative, a very good marketing and sales guy, and advertising guy, and he did an incredible job. Once he got involved with the business, he ran the advertising and the marketing, and he made the business even bigger. My grandfather was more of a finance guy.
Yeah.
With numbers, accounting. That was his background. Yeah. My father was marketing, advertising. That's what he learned in college. Yeah. And he was very good at it, obviously. So my father came up with all kind of ways of increasing the business and getting people in there, and he did an incredible job. He linked up with all the hotels on Miami Beach to put package deals together so all the tourists would come to Miami Jai-Alai. He put Miami Jai-Alai billboards all over the buses, all over Miami. So drive in Miami, you'd see, oh, it says Miami Jai-Alai. What is that? He did an incredible job of expanding the business, unlike anybody has ever seen. He was unbelievable at that. And my father got friendly with a lot of the media, and he did a lot of interviews, and he was very good on doing interviews. And he was very popular, and he did an incredible job. My father, I think, had more impact overall on expanding the game in terms of the business than even my grandfather. My grandfather started at getting it legalized and did some good things, but my father really got it to explode.
And also, he often traveled to the Basque Country to recruit players. Is that so? Did you go with him on these trips?
Yes. Well, in my case, I learned how to play Jai-Alai at a very young age, very young. And I learned all of the ins and outs of Jai-Alai, how to evaluate players from Pedro Mir and also Joey's coach, Epifanio, science. So I had the advantage of them being my teachers, and they taught me everything you could imagine about Jai-Alai. I mean, I'll give you one example just to tell you. For instance, I always wondered, how come Fernando Orbea, had such a tremendous picada where he would throw with the right hand and the ball would bounce like I've never seen.
Yeah.
And besides the fact that he just it was an incredible player and a very strong wrist, he also would tie his cesta lower on the hand. So he had more flexibility with the wrist than anybody else. But I learned all those nuances from Pedro and from Epifanio. So I literally knew the game even better than my father. So I was going with my father to recruit players since right after right during the first Jai-Alai players strike. I was only like I was 14 or 15 years old, and I would go to Spain with my father and Mexico and other places, and I would help my father evaluate what players we wanted to sign or not, even at that young age, because I knew the game inside and out, even that young. So my father relied on me as an evaluator. Pedro Mir relied on me as an evaluator, and we had our chief scout, a guy named Alfonso Ramos.
Chinche Ramos, right? They call Chinche.
Yes, that was him. A little guy, real little guy, but a very good evaluator. And we would meet with them, and then he would show us the players who he thought we would be interested in. But I watched everybody. I took his advice, but I wanted to see for myself. So, and Pedro Mir went on some of the trips with us, but he had a bad leg, so it was hard for him to travel. But my father relied on me, and we signed some incredible Jai-Alai players over those years. I mean, I'll take some credit for that.
What was your father's concept about Basque players as people? See,
he thought they were great people. He thought they were friendly. They were strong, very strong. They were very opinionated in that they had opinions on things and stuck to it. He liked them. He got along great with them. With most of them. I mean, obviously you're not going to get along with everybody, but he got along well with them. I think my grandfather, probably because of his personality, got along with him better. My father was not, how should I say, he didn't have a big personality. He was kind of a quiet person. He was not super friendly with people, unlike my grandfather, who would go and grab and hug somebody and give him a kiss and, hey, how you doing? He was amazing. So I think the players probably liked my grandfather better, to be honest with you. But they respected my father, that's for sure. My father wasn't the type to go around and put his arm around somebody and say, oh, how you doing? That wasn't him.
Richard, in 1968, players went on a strike. What are your memories? Was that a big, your father was upset, surprised? What was his reaction, the family's reaction?
Okay. He was very upset. Very angry. He didn't understand why the players did it at the time. Remember, my grandfather had just died a year earlier, so my father had took over, and he took it personally, I think. He never got totally over that. He felt betrayed. He didn't understand why they didn't at least come and maybe negotiate and show up at the fronton. They didn't do that. They didn't even try to really negotiate. They just basically said, we don't know what they wanted, other than they wanted the Montepillo as their organization, I guess a union, to represent them in every way. And my father said, well, I don't know anything about the Montepillo. I only know you guys, but if you want to have a representative come with you, we can talk. But they never did that. They never came. We learned only a couple months before the season that they were not coming. So my father and I had to scramble, going all over the place, the Basque Country, Mexico, the Philippines. I mean, we went all over the place to recruit and get highlight players for that season, the 1969 season, because none of them, only Mendiola was the only player who came. He was the only one. And we couldn't believe it. He was in shock. I was a young boy, so I didn't really understand all the implications at that time. But it was very disappointing. To this day, even before my father died, I don't think he totally could understand why they did that. I mean, it was just the weirdest. I mean, normally in a strike, you show up, you try to negotiate. If doesn't work, you go out and you picket and whatever, like happened in the second strike. They didn't even do that. So it was very disappointing. And I think he held a bit of a grudge, to be honest with you, against those players for doing that. He felt betrayed.
Yeah, that's why after that, Fronton's owners confectioned a blacklist where all the strikers will never play in Florida.
Yes, I think. I think they're. I don't know if there was officially. Let's put it this way: there wasn't like a grand list on paper of, oh, here's the players we're not going to take. But basically, it was, well, the players that didn't come back, which is almost everybody, we don't want them anymore. That's kind of the attitude that us and the other frontons took, and they took other players from all over the place, as did we.
Yeah.
And we assembled a pretty good roster, but the problem was we had the best roster in the world for many, many years. And then you go and you have a roster that we had a few good players, but most of the players were not very good. Let's be honest. They were not very good. We needed them to fill roster spots so we could have our games and the season go on. But it was really it was a tough time. I got to tell you, it was a tough time. And that year, our attendance went down quite a bit. The money that was bet, called the handle, surprisingly didn't go down all that much, because a lot of the gamblers that only interested in gambling, they didn't care who the players were. They were just betting numbers. They were still betting like before, but we did lose. Look, we lost a lot of highlight fans. And I remember my father would tell me, because remember, I was too young to go on the fronton at that time during the games. He would say, a lot of people would say, oh, these guys stink. They're no good. And why don't you bring back the old players? And, we want to see Chiruca and Orbea and Bengoa and Larrañaga and Guarita and Chimela. Where are these guys? These guys you got now, they're nowhere near as good. And my father said, well, you're right. They aren't anywhere near as good, but I had to start somewhere, and they didn't show up. He tried to explain to them. But it was very rough. It was very rough.
Was that a kind of lessons in you don't need good players because people don't care, people go to the fronton, they bet their money, or your father said, okay, no way, we're going to try to get the best players year by year as it happened?
Okay, there's what I call a dichotomy here, meaning there were a lot of people who were just strictly gamblers. They didn't care who we had on the court. But there was also a large amount of people, more than most people thought, that were there because they loved the gamble, but more than that, they loved to watch great highlight because it's such an incredibly exciting, fantastic, skillful game. So it was both. So we needed both. In other words, we did what we could to get gamblers in there, But we also did what we could to get the fans in there, and we always wanted to have the best Jai-Alai roster in the world.
Richard, what was the year, 1969 or 1967, that your father purchased Tampa Jai-Alai?
Okay, that was, well, it was at the very end of the year in 60, so let's call it 1970. In 1970, we purchased Tampa Jai-Alai. We heard it was for sale. The Kramer family, quite frankly, did a lousy job running the place. The fronton didn't look good. They didn't have very good players, which I can't blame them because of the strike. Prior to that, they did have some good players. They had one particular player that was very good that we wanted, but we didn't end up getting him because of the strike. His name was Albero. Very good player, front court. And they had a couple other pretty good players that we were interested in. But when the strike came, they ended up getting a really bad roster. So my father bought the place. We immediately did some, we made the fronton look nicer. We put some money into it to make it more attractive. We put in great food, really good food, which we always had at all our Jai-Alais. That was very important to my father because he felt like, they wanted to have the whole experience of dining, gambling, watching great Jai-Alai and all that. So we upgraded the facility of Tampa Jai-Alai. But the biggest thing we did was two things. One, my father, as I told you before, knew how to market and advertise. He did an incredible job doing that. And also, we upgraded the Jai-Alai roster dramatically over a few years. There's one other thing that my father did that was amazing that no one had done before. He started rock concerts during the off season at Miami Jai-Alai back in the late 60s. And the reason he did that, it wasn't for the money we would make from the concerts. It was to get young people interested in Jai-Alai. Because prior to that, most of the people there were older people. He wanted to get young people. So when they went to the concerts, he would hand out leaflets about Jai-Alai, and we ended up getting a lot of young people because of that. And ironically, other pari-mutuel facilities all over the United States later on started running rock concerts and other concerts at their facilities. So that was something my father started before anybody else. He was very innovative. He also changed the scoring system to the Spectacular 7, which also helped the betting. He did that himself with a professor at University of Miami Math School. They came up with that formula together, and as you know, everyone still uses it. So it must be awfully good.
Yeah. And also, he opened up a fronton up in Ocala and in Fort Pierce.
Right. We wanted to expand Jai-Alai as much as we could in Florida because we tried to do it in other states, and we were not doing very well with that at the time. Talking about the early 70s. And we also had a lot of players from our Jai-Alai school in Guernica, and there were other schools all over Spain that had a lot of young players. So we wanted to have the opportunity to let a lot of these young players have a place to play in Florida, in the United States. So initially, we put good players in there with a mix of young players to get everyone excited. But our main goal was eventually to make it like a farm system for Miami and Tampa.
Was he afraid in any moment that American young players would start playing because they were more difficult to handle? See, with the best players went on a visa kind of license to work, and that was a kind of keeping away the union, or there's not any sense in that.
No. The reason my father started the school at Miami Jai-Alai School, and the reason he wanted American players was for diversity. He wanted to have not just Spanish Basque, he wanted French Basque, he wanted Mexican players, he wanted American, Philippine players. I mean, he wanted a cosmopolitan group of players. He felt that was, everyone would prefer that.
Yeah. Richard, in 1975, he lost control of World Jai-Alai. Is that so? Is that right?
Yes. Remember, we only controlled 19% of the stock. And unfortunately, despite my father's unbelievable success, making his partners very wealthy, thanks to him, not them, some of them did not like my father. And I'm going to tell you why, and it's so ridiculous you're not going to believe it. My father, most of the owners were very highly educated. Several of them were Harvard lawyers, okay? And my father grew up in Florida. Keep that in mind. And my father went to the University of Florida, and then he went to the University of Miami. He never finished college because he went to the war and joined the Coast Guard during World War II. So he never had the kind of education that they had. But my father was an incredibly bright person. It doesn't matter. And he obviously knew what he was doing. But because they had a bias against people from the South. The Northerners think that they're, and that time, and maybe still today, I don't know, they think they're smarter than people from the South. So when World Jai-Alai was expanding, they didn't want my father running the business. They didn't think he was capable. Did they think he was capable of running Miami Jai-Alai and the players and all that? Of course they did. But when we got expanding, they wanted to bring in experts or whatever in business, not Jai-Alai, but other business to expand. And they wanted to get my father, keep him where he was at Miami Jai-Alai and not run the company. And they brought in a guy named John Callahan to run the show.
Yeah, people from Boston, is that right? Yeah.
Correct.
Yes. And in 1977, he sold the part of World Jai-Alai, no? Is that right, Richard?
Well, what happened was,
he got rid of his stocks.
Here's what happened. We had what's called a proxy fight. Because remember, at that time, World Jai-Alai was a public company. You could trade the stock, okay? It was a public company. So my father initiated with his lawyer a proxy fight against those partners that didn't like my father to take over the company. We lost. It was a very close vote. We lost. We later found out that some of the partners had been intimidated by very bad people.
Mm-hmm.
And my father and I were both threatened on numerous occasions not to fight them. And quite frankly, we were worried about our own health at the time. Very worried. And when we lost the proxy fight, they wanted to buy my father out. And they wanted him out. They didn't want him anywhere near the facility. They didn't want him. They wanted to get rid of him because he wanted to try to take over the company. He lost, so they said, well, he's got to go. He's got to go.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, they fired my father. They fired me for no reason. I mean, I was doing a great job, and we sold the stock. My father sold his stock, and got a good price for it. I have to admit that. And then later, the stock that my grandfather had left my sister and myself, Wheeler, we sold out to Wheeler. Later, after we lost the proxy fight, they were looking to sell to somebody, and they ended up selling to Roger Wheeler.
Mm-hmm. Boston Mafia killed Roger Wheeler, by the way.
Okay.
How
Roger Wheeler.
Yes.
Let me explain. All right. Roger Wheeler was a completely legitimate businessman. He was represented. He used the Bank of Boston. Here we go, back to the Bank of Boston. He was looking for investments because he was making a ton of money. He was a brilliant guy. So they decided that World Jai-Alai would be a great investment for him. And the price that it went for, they thought would be a great price. So he didn't know anything about Jai-Alai. He didn't know about my father. He didn't know anything other than the numbers that he saw as a businessman. And he bought the company, and all of a sudden, he noticed that there were some problems with the company. The business wasn't doing the kind of business it was doing and taking in the kind of money when my father was running it. So he was suspicious, being a brilliant guy like himself. So then John Callahan was in trouble with the state of Connecticut, because by that time we had gotten Jai-Alai legalized in Connecticut, and we had the Hartford Jai-Alai going. They would not give John Callahan a license because they said that he was known to be friendly with mob figures in Boston. So they wouldn't give him a license. So Callahan had to resign because of that as head of Jai-Alai. Richard Donovan, who was his partner, took over the job, along with H. Paul Rico, who was an FBI agent, retired, that was brought into the company primarily to dig up dirt and try to get rid of my father. He found no dirt on my father, nothing. So they were running the company for Wheeler. Wheeler then decided that he was going to sell Hartford Jai-Alai in 1980. So there were two possible buyers at the time: my father and the owner of Bridgeport, Robert Zeff.
Yep.
We bid higher for the Jai-Alai than Zeff did, and we ended up buying Hartford Jai-Alai. And Roger Wheeler said, "You know, I've heard a lot of terrible things about you, buddy, from Donovan and Rico and the management, you know. But after negotiating with you and meeting you, and I don't see what they're talking about. There's something wrong here." And my father then talked to Wheeler frankly about what he thought, and Wheeler opened his eyes. And then when we bought Hartford Jai-Alai, part of the financing is Wheeler wanted to keep a second mortgage of a couple $1 million or so on the loan, because he wanted us to give him all of our financials to compare with the previous year at Hartford. Well, lo and behold, even though we were doing less attendance and a little less handle the first year we got in there, we were bringing in more money. And we would send him these weekly reports. And my father, I'm also similar to my grandfather. I have a finance accounting background like my grandfather. So I was the chief financial officer for Hartford Jai-Alai when we owned it. So I did all that, and I reviewed the numbers, and I went to my father and I said, "Dad, there's something wrong here." He says, "Well, what do you mean?" I go, "Why are we taking in 30% more money on the non-gambling revenue when our attendance is down and we didn't raise any prices? And look at the parking. It's the most ridiculous of all." So my father said to me, he said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think there's skimming going on here. What else could it be? It can't be incompetence, my God, that they had. I mean, they weren't that bad running the company. Come on." So Wheeler looked at the numbers and his accountant, and they said, "Oh boy, this is not good." So then Wheeler was suspicious. And after we had Hartford Jai-Alai for about 6 months and all, and then we were doing better business by then, because my father did a lot of his good work with marketing and advertising and stuff. We were doing better, and then we were bringing in a lot more money than they were doing. And Wheeler was really upset about it. And also, the remaining Jai-Alais, Ocala, Fort Pierce, Miami, and Tampa, their revenues were not where he thought they should be either, based on the business, because the business was still doing great in Florida. So Wheeler was concerned told my father he was concerned for his life. And he said, "You better be concerned for your life too." And we said, "Oh, we know from the proxy fight we were worried." So about 2 weeks or so before Wheeler was murdered, my father had a conversation that we now believed was wiretapped by the bad people, we'll say. I'm calling them the bad people. And at that point, Roger Wheeler said, "Buddy, I've decided that I want to sell you 60% of what's left of World Jai-Alai, Miami, Tampa, Ocala, Fort Pierce, and half of Guernica. And I'm going to get all the financing for you. And I'm going to keep 40%. And I'm going to try to help you get Jai-Alais in other places like New York, Chicago, big places, because I have a lot of clout because I'm well known and obviously a very wealthy guy." So that was the plan. It never happened because Wheeler was murdered, as you know, at his country club in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Why, Richard, why did he kill John Callahan as well?
Because from what I understand, Callahan was going to be talked to by the FBI and the state police, and they were afraid that he was going to talk.
I see.
So rather than talk, they killed him.
Yeah, yeah, I see. And then was the Hartford purchase a bargain for you, for the Berenson family?
Was it what?
A bargain? You're cheap? You were cheap?
It turned out to, at the time, it wasn't. But after we were very successful, it turned out to be cheap. But it was a very fair deal. We paid maybe a little more than it was worth at the time, but not much more. And it turned out to be a great deal. But I do want to add one more thing. We were later told that our phones were tapped in the office, maybe our home phones too. And we also, the first month after Roger Wheeler was killed or so, we were concerned for our own lives. And when we were in Connecticut, we had a security guard around us at all times. And when we would go home to our townhouse in Farmington, Connecticut, where we lived when we were there, we would have a security guard with a shotgun driving with us home, taking us home every night for about 2 or 3 months, whether it was me or my father, and we took turns being up there running the business. And when we were in Florida, we were very low key and didn't go out much for a while because we legitimately thought we were going to be killed next.
And besides that, in 1988, another strike, 20 years after the first one. No peace in Jai-Alai for the Berenson family, Richard.
For anybody, that was awful. But I have a very unique perspective on that strike. I didn't have one on the 68 strike because I was, 14 years old, and wasn't that involved. This one, I was very involved, and I'm going to tell you the whole story the way I see it. Okay. When we learned that there was a player, and I don't remember his name, in Bridgeport, who wrote a manifesto.
Pedro Olarreta. Olarreta, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's the name.
Because,
now I remember
Richard, at that time I was in Bridgeport. And also, I'm one of the first persons that listens to Olarreta's manifesto. That was a matinee in Bridgeport. We were playing the 2 groups. I belonged to the second group, and he called us and he read to paper manifesto, by the way. So,
okay, so that was when we first learned about some problems brewing. Up until that time, Hartford Jai-Alai paid the highest salaries of any Jai-Alai in the world, by far. Bridgeport paid very well, as did Milford. We all paid more than the Florida Jai-Alais, I can tell you that. Okay, so the next thing we know is the Lassa family got involved, and they were telling all the players that they should go on strike, along with Olarreta. And I think it was in the middle of April of that year, all of a sudden, the players go out on strike. They decide not to come.
But Richard, could it be because the owners didn't want to recognize the union, IJAPA, and then the players decided to go on a strike?
Yes.
Owners didn't want to know anything about dealing with the union.
All right, let me tell you. Okay, so prior to the players going on strike, you're right. I need to go back a moment. You're right. Prior to the players going on strike, they hired a lawyer named Robert Chevary. And he was advising them how to form a union. And he contacted us and told us that they wanted to have a union. So we said, well, you have to go through the National Labor Relations Board format, and it takes time. It could take up to 6 months or longer to get your union certified if you have a vote that the players wanted. Okay, so the players were told that by Chevary and by us. So we began negotiating with Chevary, but here's the problem. And the same thing happened in Florida. All of the frontons got together. We got together with Bridgeport and Milford, and all the Florida frontons got together, and we made a tremendously bad decision. Tremendously bad. We all hired one lawyer to represent all of us. The Florida frontons hired one lawyer, a guy in Miami, and we hired a law firm out of New Jersey, I think it was. And Robert Zeff, who was a very famous lawyer, we relied on him to tell us who to hire. He was the owner of Bridgeport, as you know. Well, he decided, and I'm going to say my father and the people at Milford agreed, to hire the law firm that were known as Union Busters. Florida did the same thing, I believe. Well, that was a tragic mistake by the owners and the management. We should have hired a lawyer that was a good negotiator, not lawyers whose only job was to delay, do everything they could to stop the union from getting in. That was a tragic mistake. So the players, I blame us for hiring those lawyers. To this day, I can't stand them. I didn't like them when I was dealing with them. They didn't like me because I had different views than everybody else in the room. But that was terrible. But I also blame the players in the sense that they could have waited. They could have waited. They would have won in terms of getting their union certified. It was only another maybe 6 months. At that time, I can't speak for other highlights, but we were not doing any unfair labor charges against any of the individual players. We weren't doing any of that. They claimed some of the other highlights were, maybe they were. I honestly don't know. So they unfortunately, their mistake was going out on strike to begin with. Our mistake was hiring union busting lawyers not willing to really negotiate and letting the strike go as long as it did. We are at fault. Totally at fault.
Was your father ready to negotiate from the first moment, or he said, no, wait, no,
you know what?
Not over my body?
No, not exactly. My father was a great businessman, and he wasn't emotional at all on this. He was more, I'll negotiate with the players in terms of maybe better benefits, maybe better money, better prize money. I'll negotiate, but I do not want a union here because I don't want a union controlling the players because I don't trust unions. That was his, in honesty, that's what it was all about. It wasn't because he didn't like, no, it's not it. He didn't want a union. He didn't trust a union. And he said, who is this lawyer, Robert Chevalier? I don't know anything about him. Who was he? So the other mistake I think that the union made was aligning themselves with the UAW, because that just prolonged the strike too, because they were helping them financially, the players and all that. So we all made terrible mistakes. Nobody gets off unscathed here, including the management, the players, the union, the lawyers. Everybody's at fault. Okay. And the strike should never have lasted that long. We should have gone in there, negotiated with them once that they were certified, and after 6 months or so, and try to get this over with. But we didn't do that. We let the strike go on and on and on. And it's sad. It's awful. It was, what can I say?
Yeah.
It was an awful thing. And let me say one other thing about the strike. A couple other things, actually. I didn't agree with my father or the other owners in Bridgeport or Milford. I didn't agree with them on these lawyers. I said we should negotiate right now with the players after they got their certification around 6 months after the strike. I said, we need to negotiate now. We cannot keep putting this off. We're losing a lot of money. There's some of the players, a minority of them, were doing terrible things in the picket line, which were alienating our customers. We got to stop the bleeding. Let's meet with the players. Oh, we're not meeting with the players. No, we're going to deal with lawyers. I said, well, look, I have a very good rapport personally, me with the players. Let me meet with them without lawyers. Let me meet with them, with Lassa and the other players, and see and tell them, find out what they want, what they're talking about, let them know how we feel, and have a frank discussion about how we can get this strike over with. Marty Fleshman did the same thing. He and I are best friends. He did the same thing in World Jai-Alai. He asked them the same thing that I did. Let me talk to the players without the lawyers. and see, because he had a great relationship with them too. They didn't let us do it. The other highlight owners, including my father, said, no, Rich, you're not going to do it. We're not going to do that. The lawyer said, no way in the world would they let you do that. And the same thing happened with Marty. He wasn't allowed to do it either. I really believe, had we been able to do that, it's possible that the strike could have ended a lot sooner. I really believe that to this day. And so does Marty.
Stubborn people on both sides.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Stubborn people who listen to their lawyers. And guess who made the money here? The lawyers. They made a fortune by us not having a deal.
There's a point where there's a clash of egos.
Yes.
Do you agree? Yes.
I agree. Absolutely. And the other thing that really didn't help the union is when they did not strike Milford, because that made my father incredibly angry and made Robert Zeff incredibly angry, and it made them have even more anger against the highlight players and the union, because they said, this is not fair. Milford's making all this money, and they're just, and yet they don't have a union, and they're making all this money. They didn't strike them. That's not fair. So that didn't, let me tell you something, that didn't help. That didn't help my cause when I was trying to talk to the players, and they say, oh yeah, we can really trust them. Look what they did at Milford. What could I say? I mean, that was a terrible thing, you know. So it was everybody lost. Everybody lost.
The worst scenario, right? The worst, both sides, everybody losing.
Everybody lost. It was a terrible thing. And both sides are to blame to some extent. 3
years of labor conflict, attendance going down, handle too, right?
We were finished. And let me say this, it was the worst possible timing, because at the same time we were getting Indian casinos in Connecticut.
That's right.
And that killed, and the two governors told my father to his face and the other highlight owners, you're going to get slot machines. And we never got them. So we never couldn't compete with the Indians. And that's one of the main reasons, along with the strike, that we had to close it down.
We can call it a perfect storm. What did happen?
Perfect storm.
Yeah. Okay.
All at once.
Let me ask you something, Richard. You said you are a financial man. You know, that's what you study for. Was a decline of handle in the previous seasons of the strikes? You could see that the business was going down, or the strike blew up everything?
No, we were going up every year.
You were going up every year?
In Hartford, I'm talking about Hartford.
Yeah.
We were going up every year, and then when the strike happened, it was dramatic. I mean, it was from a high to a low. I mean, it was just dramatic. We were still doing fine and well right through up until the strike, and then everything fell apart.
In what measure the strike suppose the beginning of the end for Jai-Alai?
Well, it had a huge part, especially in Connecticut, because in Connecticut, the players were allowed to do basically whatever they wanted on the picket line, because the Hartford and Bridgeport police were union, and they sided with the players. So the players were doing a lot of bad things, you know, very embarrassing things. And I was shocked. And it alienated people. And when we did end the strike, most of our people wouldn't come back because of what the players did on the picket line. And it was really sad. You know, and it's only and the thing is, it was only a few of the players doing it. It wasn't the majority of them, only a few.
Yeah. Richard, we the players thought that Jai-Alai owners were making tons of money, see, a money-making machine. The question is, what was the percentage, the net percentage of the revenues that you got, money to the pocket? Okay.
Well, you got to remember, the handle, the money that was bet, of that, we got about 11% of that. The state got about 5 or 6, and then the rest went to the winners. And then we made money on the concessions and the parking. Our best year at Hartford Jai-Alai, we made $4.5 million in that year.
So what was the percentage?
It was a low percentage when you consider the amount of money that was bet. So it's hard to give you that number. But like I said, we kept about 11% of the money that was bet, and then the state had about 5 or 6, 7. I don't remember it. I think it was 7 or 8, and the rest would go back to the winners. So that's a finite number we would get from what was bet, and then we made money from the admissions and parking and all that, which was a much smaller amount, obviously. But I can tell you that the best year we ever had, we made $4.5 million that year. And we had a couple of those years.
Yeah.
And then the strike happened and we lost money.
Yeah. Hartford closed its doors in 1995. 66 years of Jai-Alai, more or less, for the Berenson family. Jai-Alai is over. What are your memories?
Okay, I'm going to tell you why we closed the Jai-Alai. The attendance and handle were going down every year, even after the strike. We couldn't make any money. And here's what happened that was really tragic. The union had told the players during the strike that if you have any injuries at all, go to workman's compensation, because they have very liberal laws in Connecticut, not Florida, but in Connecticut on workman's comp. Well, they did that. And before the strike, we were paying in premium for workman's comp a year about $50,000. By the last year of our Jai-Alai operation, we were paying $600,000 a year in workman's comp premium. So I did, in the beginning of 1995, I did a pro forma of what I thought we were going to do business-wise, and I've been very accurate with that, by the way, because in prior years. And I came to the realization that because of the 600,000 workman's comp, we could not make any money. We would only lose some money. So I said to my father, here's the numbers. They don't lie. This breaks my heart. We got to close. And we closed in September. We gave a 60 or 90-day notice to the union and the other union we had. And it was over.
No,
so I've been out of Jai-Alai business-wise. I've been out 30 years now.
So at that time you were 40 years old, more or less, right?
Yes.
And then
more or less.
You had to start doing other things, new jobs, new management.
Well, no, what I did was I ended up buying real estate down in Florida and managing it myself. And I also was doing stock option trading myself, which I still do. But I'm getting near the end here. I'm 70 years old, so I'm looking to retire very soon. I've worked hard all my life, so I'm ready.
Yeah. And
I would like to point out one other thing that we kind of missed, if you don't mind. A lot of people ask why a number of the Jai-Alai players that went on strike in 1968 ended up coming back to play in the frontons. I'm the reason. Me. I convinced my father in the early 70s. I said, Dad, we should bring these great players back. The strike is long gone. There's no reason not to. We need to bring them back. And at that time, Bridgeport was signing most of them. But I said there were still some out there. And I said there were 2 particular players I wanted to start with. And I said, and at that time we were looking to upgrade Tampa's roster and really make it great. I said, there's 2 players I want, and I've always wanted them because they played at Dania, and I wish we had them. One of them was, the first one was Goronio, who's one of my favorite players, by the way. The other one was Jesus Barrieta.
Right.
2 fantastic, great players. And I had to talk my father into it, but he finally relented, and we signed him. Those 2, we ended up later signing Julian Guenechea, who was a player that played in Miami. He was a very good backcourt to Tampa as well. And then we ended up signing more and more. I would have signed more, but Bridgeport had beaten me to it.
Yeah.
But I had finally convinced him, don't hold the grudge anymore. Let's get him. So that's why a lot of them play, because I brought him back.
You mentioned 2 favorite players, Goronio and Jesus Barrieta. More players that you really like it throughout your Jai-Alai years?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you
even before the 68. Well, you were too young, maybe.
No, I got to see all these great guys. And I'm going to tell you, to me, there are 5 players of all the generations that I've watched who are the greatest players I've ever seen. One is Orbea, Fernando Orbea. 2 is Bengoa. 3 is Guarita. 4 is Larrañaga. And you can guess who number 5 is, Churruca. Those 5 players, for me personally, and my father would agree if he were here, were the greatest highlight players of any era that I've seen or he's seen. They are, you know, artistas, I don't know what you call them, but they were just in a league of their own, unbelievable players. My father's 2 favorite players, by the way, were Bengoa and Churruca.
And also Chimela.
Chimela also. Chimela. He's right below that level, you know what I mean? But he's right in there. And we love Chimela. What a wonderful player. Exciting. The fans love Chimela. And nobody could climb the walls like Chimela and Churruca. Those 2, unbelievable.
You know what he said when I interviewed him in Miami, in his home 2 years ago, recalling the first seasons, he told me, I still don't know how Berenson gave me a contract because I was such a terrible player at that time. See? So your dad or Pedro Mir or someone had a good clinic eye.
Well, I'm going to tell you the story. I actually know that story. This was before I went. I was a little boy when Chimela first got to Miami in the early 60s, right? So, but I remember my father telling me a story that he and Pedro were in Spain and they were watching, and my father said, who is this guy Chimela? And my grandfather, and Pedro Mir said, oh, you don't want him. He's no good.
Pedro Mir
he has no right. He has no right side at all. He's only left. He's strong, but he doesn't. He's too green. He's not ready. You don't want him. My father said, to hell, I don't want him. I'm taking him right now. And we signed him, and, you know, the rest is history. So that my father gets credit for that.
You mentioned a couple of great names, Orbea, Guarita, Churruca, Bengoa. What about Bolivar, Richard? He was the superstar in Tampa, and suddenly he decided to go to Bridgeport. What did your dad said? You couldn't be stopped? Couldn't be offered more money when he said, I'm leaving, or yes, he left?
What year did he leave?
I believe it was 1975.
All right. I don't, to tell you the truth, I don't remember why we didn't get to keep him. That one I don't remember. But I can tell you one thing. I originally wanted Bolivar to come to Miami, not Tampa. But my father said, no, we need a star in Tampa. So, okay.
And he didn't want to go to Miami. That's what he says.
And I wanted him at Miami, but my father didn't listen to me.
Because he was such a superstar in Tampa, and in Miami, you know what kind of roster they had at that time.
Yeah, no, Bolivar is a great player. I like him personally. I wish him well. I don't know why he went to Bridgeport, but look, he did what he thought was best for him, and I give him, you know, good. That's fine. And he was a star there with all those stars and got to play with those old superstars. And I think it probably worked out overall good for him. But yeah, he's a great player. Joey is a great player. I mean, I could go on and on. I was just telling you the top 5 in my opinion, but there's plenty, you know, right there. You know what I mean?
And what about the singles player playing the singles?
Well, Orbea was an amazing singles player because of his serve. I mean, he put so much picada on the serve that you'd always be trying to get the ball on the side of the back wall. It was very difficult and put him in a hard position. But another guy I love as a singles player was Assis.
Yes.
Oh my good, what a singles player! Oh my good, and a great guy, by the way. Wonderful guy.
Richard, after so many years, what do you feel most proud of it? Your family's legacy. What's your balance after you're 70 years old? Everything is history. When we mention the Berensons, what comes to your mind?
Well, I tell you, I think because of my grandfather and my father, they made Jai-Alai very successful in Florida, and then it went to Connecticut and Rhode Island, a couple other states. I know it was in Las Vegas, but that didn't really work out too well. But I think the golden age of Jai-Alai in Florida and Connecticut is all due to my grandfather getting it legalized, some of his ideas with the form of betting, and my father with his marketing and his other ideas that he did, the scoring system and all the great things he did. And we loved Jai-Alai. I mean, you could tell we loved it. I don't think the other owners didn't love Jai-Alai like we did. I can assure you of that, because none of them came up with any ideas. None of them. It was always us. And so I'm very proud of that. And I think Jai-Alai without the Berensons would not have made it in the United States. I really believe that. And the one good thing that I'm sorry that it ultimately failed for all the reasons we discussed. Too much competition. The Indian casinos just killed us. And the other thing is Jai-Alai never changed. It remained the same from when my father came up with all these ideas.
Richard, there's a little fronton in Miami, Magic City. What do you think about it? Have you ever been there?
No, I've never been there. You know, again, some of the players have told me about it, and I wish them well. I hope that they're successful, but I really can't say much about that. I haven't been there. I haven't seen it, so I really haven't. But I can tell you, I was at Dania the other day, last Saturday, for the World Championships, those partidos. And let me tell you, I was very impressed with some of those young players I saw. Of course, I spotted Lopez a number of years ago when he started at Dania, and I remember telling Marty Fleshman at the time, who was PR director and marketing there, I said, "Who is this guy Lopez?" He said, "Oh, he's a new player we have." I said, "I can tell you right now, he's going to be one of the best players in the world, without a doubt." And of course, I was right. And I love watching him play. He's a wonderful player. One of my favorites now. And there was a couple other players. Again, I think Achille or a couple other players I really liked also. I can't remember their names. I saw them for the first time.
Any future for Tampa Jai-Alai? How do you see it, Richard?
Well, I think my good friend Benny Bueno has done a magnificent job getting the management to run Jai-Alai for the 3 months that they're running it. I hope he's able to convince them to do it every year. I told him, I said, "Listen, you did a fantastic job. It was the presentations, everything was well done." I said, "I hope you're able to get him here next year." He said, "Oh, I think so." I said, "Well, when you have the championships and all that next year or whatever, I'll see you next year and come and visit, and so I can watch Jai-Alai." I love watching Jai-Alai. I'm a big fan myself.
Yeah, but as far as pari mutuals, Richard, are they beating a dead horse?
Yes. I don't see any future for Jai-Alai in Florida or in the United States the way it is now. But I am very encouraged from the players that I talk to still. I'm very encouraged by what's going on in Spain and France with the televised Jai-Alai. We always wanted to televise Jai-Alai, but back in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, there wasn't enough sophistication with the cameras that you could do it justice. Now you can with the technology we have. So now people are being able to watch Jai-Alai as if they were there. And because it's such an incredibly exciting, fantastic sport, for me, it's the greatest sport. It's skills and everything involved. Excitement, my goodness. I think now that people in Spain and France are being able to watch Jai-Alai and appreciate it, I think it's going to create a lot more fans. And I think Jai-Alai in the Basque Country and maybe other areas of Spain and France, I think it's going to grow and do very well there, and I'm so happy about that. And I also have said, somebody asked me a few years ago, how can Jai-Alai be saved in general? And I said, well, you need to get Jai-Alai on television and with good technology. This is back maybe 20 years ago. I said, that's number one. I said, number two, you need to get Jai-Alai back in the Olympics, so everybody in the world can watch the Olympics and see Jai-Alai. That's a huge key. And I said, number three, you need to get some type of commissioner, ambassador representing all of Jai-Alai that can talk to the media, that can show how great this sport is, how it deserves to be recognized and all over the world. And there should be tremendous tournaments for a lot of money and all that. That's similar to tennis, I guess you could say, in a way. That's how you save jai-alai. Maybe not in the United States, but hey, the United States is not the only game in town. How about Europe? How about other areas? So that's my vision of how jai-alai could be saved in general. And so far, step one is happening, that the televised jai-alai in Spain and France. And I was so happy to do an interview, and I wish they would have asked me more questions because it was a lot of fun.
Richard Berenson, I want to thank you from my heart for talking
Thank
to
you so much.
And it's been great. And there's no question that there's no way to understand the history of jai-alai in the United States without the Berenson family.
Thank you. Thank you.
By the way, say hello to your friend Mary Fleischman. Okay?
I'm going to do it later today for sure.
And tell him that I want to interview him too as well, because I think
Absolutely.
you two are very two figures that know a lot about the history of jai-alai, and we have to responsibility of keeping that alive. See, the legacy of the game, the history. Okay,
that's right. And Marty, look, Marty's older than me. He's going to be 76 years old in May. So, yeah, I think that he would be a wonderful person for you to interview. He can give you all kind of insights into what he and I went through when we were in the jai-alai business. Probably better insights than me in terms of some personal things that he could tell you about me and him and stuff like that, about dealing with jai-alai players and all the fun we had, and just wonderful stories. He's got some great stories.
Okay, and probably he's in a good shape because he did work less worries than you.
You know what? He's in better shape than me because he plays pickleball, and he's a tremendous pickleball player. In fact, in the senior league, he's won many championships.
Mm-hmm.
He's in better shape than me.
So, and probably he's a better pickleball player than a jai-alai player, because I remember him when he started in Tampa. Was his second year, his second season, my first season, and I remember him seeing him practicing, and I believe you. I'm pretty sure that he's a better pickleball player.
Yeah, he's. You know what? You don't need power to play pickleball. Right. He has no power. That's why in jai-alai, he was one of those guys that, and I played with him all the time as amateurs, and he and I were the opposite. He had a terrible form, bad postura and all that, but he caught the ball all the time and played better than you would imagine he would play. Me, I had great form, a lot of power. I looked like I was good, but I wasn't very good. So that was how that worked.
Richard, take care.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Bye-bye. Nice.
Bye-bye.